Conversations with the inspiring minds, using design and creativity towards social change. This is Design for the People with Greg Bunbury.
Hello and welcome to Design for the People. I'm your host, Greg Bunbury, and on this show, I'll be speaking to the designers, artists, creative thinkers and activists using their skills to tackle social issues, uplift communities, and make a difference in the world. Joining me on today's show is Nilesh Patel. Nilesh is an architect, creative director, and filmmaker. For over 20 years, his work has covered architecture, landscape design, interiors, and furniture, with him overseeing multi-million-pound projects along the way. In addition to this, Nilesh makes short films and documentaries. His award-winning work has been screened by the BBC, several international film festivals, exhibitions, and schools. In 2001, Nilesh released A Love Supreme, a short film comprised of a sequence of images of his mother's hands in the process of making samosas, set to a soundtrack of John Coltrane and Indian music. His work across disciplines explores narratives of race and diversity, equality and inclusion in relation to the built environment, and how we might respond to these concerns creatively. Nilesh, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you for your introduction.
No problem. Thank you for joining us today. We had an initial conversation last week, and your experience, career, and perspective is fascinating to say the least. So could we start with the beginnings of your journey into architecture?
Sure. Well, in the 1980s, I was doing my O-levels and A-levels, and I remember a two-part BBC series all about design. It was mostly about product design, and it had people like Terence Conran, Stephen Bailey, Seymour Powell, and then the Italian designers from Memphis, Braun, industrial design. And what really attracted me was the kind of lifestyle of designers. My father worked for British Gas in their offices doing sort of clerical work, and my mother worked in a knitwear factory. And neither of those two places appealed to me as a workplace. And when I saw all these designers, you know, what they were doing and the way they worked, it was the kind of lifestyle of being a designer that interested me. I thought that's kind of how I want to live and work. And I suppose also looking at things like Italian design magazines like Domus. In one magazine, you had interiors, furniture, Italian products, cars, fashion. And I was interested in all of those things. So it was that more than, wanting to be an architect.
That's great. Do you remember who made the documentary?
I don't. I think it was on BBC Two, and it was a sort of two-part documentary, and it was, sort of early 80s, I guess, because I was doing A-levels in 83 to 85, and it was during that time, I decided that, I wanted to do design.
And can you speak to the political and social climate of this time?
Well, I think I didn't know many Black or Asian designers. And so even the idea of wanting to do design, that was kind of quite original, compared to everyone else who wanted to be a doctor or accountant, or dentist or optician. You were already you're already doing something original just by wanting to do that. And that was part of the appeal. I mean, now, obviously, 2020, it's not so unusual. But at that time, you were already left field, by making that decision.
And how did your friends and family respond to your decision to get into architecture?
They were, I suppose people were a bit concerned because you didn't really know anyone who was doing that, And as I said, people did, one of 5 or 6 subjects when they went to university. Although having said that, I had an uncle who studied English in the UK in the early 1970s. So I already knew that actually, there were many more options in life than your parents might think that there are.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I find that just based on my own experience and the experiences of some of the other designers I've spoken to, is that for Black and Asian households, especially during the 70s and 80s, there was far more pressure for their children to pick career pathways that were more realistic, or at least realistic according to their perspective.
Yeah.
So kind of very tried and trusted pathways. Whenever there's a foray into more sort of creative endeavors, it's tend to viewed as quite risky.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
One of the things you said to me, which was really interesting, which was about your beginnings, at least in terms of education, getting into architecture, was that while the architectural students around you were addressing major issues in their projects, like history, aesthetics, the environment, transport, pollution, you felt that race was a difficult term for architects. Can you discuss your experience of education in terms of architecture and your postgrad project in detail?
Yes. Well, I studied architecture with some students who listened to this comedian called Roy Chubby Brown. And
I remember him.
And I thought you weren't going to know of him, but
Unfortunately, I do.
And I said that's kind of in the kind of late 1980s, and then also unfortunately, like Stephen Lawrence, I was once attacked whilst waiting for a bus by 3 or 4 people, and I was already studying architecture, unlike him who wanted to study architecture. I wasn't stabbed, but I did have to go to hospital.
Oh my God.
And then another sort of issue was getting work. And so after doing my degree, you do a year out between degree and postgrad. And, this was in the 80s. It was supposedly a sort of boom time for architecture. And I really struggled to get work. And I think I was the last person to find a year out placement. And I actually found out that I was earning 50% less than other people with the same degree from the same university.
Wow.
So there were lots of challenges, and but despite that, I did graduate and then did go back and do my postgrad. But as I mentioned, architects feel that they can, because once upon a time it was, the profession that sort of controlled everything. And there's a joke that it's the world's second oldest profession. But back in history, architects had much more power. But even now, they feel that they can tackle every issue through their work and through their ideas and projects. But race and racism were never spoken about. And in fact, even in the UK, most other professions started monitoring the makeup of the profession. And I think architecture, of the major professions, was one of the last. During my postgraduate years, I had tutors who did experimental work. And we did similar work in our 5th year. And my project was a Christian school. But it was done sort of as a theoretical project, and it departed from the curriculum. And because of that, the tutors running the course refused to assess the work from our unit. And ultimately, they passed us without grade on the basis that we produce a conventional project in our final year. And I wanted to challenge that. So I produced a conventional project, i.e. a building design, not a theoretical project.
Yeah.
But I made it difficult. And so my building was this alternative British pavilion. And I proposed that my client was the British National Party. And obviously as a black architect or Asian architect, you couldn't ignore the fact of who the author was of that project and who the fictional client was. And I had been inspired in my 5th year by the work of this American artist, Jasper Johns, who's sort of known as a pop artist, but he makes very highly figured drawings and paintings. And he's inspired by Marcel Duchamp. And I read about Marcel Duchamp and the idea of putting a urinal in a gallery, or putting a bicycle wheel on top of a stool and calling it art. And he had done really radical things that challenged what art could be. And I sort of wanted to do that as a student. What I think makes that project so unusual and radical is if you're doing a creative design course, your final project is basically showing what you've learned over many years from your art foundation course onwards. And it's basically the culmination of many years' work, and you're showing, it's a highlight of your creativity as a student, and it's the best presentation, the best graphics, it's original work. And I did the opposite. I made this very ironic project, which was almost sort of cynical. I wasn't trying to do beautiful graphics. It was drawn in the way that you might do technical drawings in an office.
Right.
And so, most students, you wouldn't risk 5 or 6 years of study by doing something like that, to make that kind of statement. But maybe I felt, inspired by Duchamp to kind of do that. But also at that time, there wasn't really work in the UK. Canary Wharf had sort of gone bankrupt. And I think the people who built it sold it. And so most architecture students were looking to work in Germany, which had been reunified. Mm. And there had been attacks on asylum seekers in Germany, including arson attacks. And so for me, the idea of finishing studying architecture and then going to Germany to work, was sort of frightening. And, if I met a German skinhead, they wouldn't know that I was British or that I was trying to be an architect. So, the possibility of going there to work wasn't really an option. But these were things that architects didn't talk about. They talked about energy and pollution and transport and housing and density and materials and sustainability, all of those things. But, people were being burnt alive, not that far away from London. So that's why I made that project.
How was it received? What was the response?
Well, I spent a lot of it wasn't done simply to provoke. And the way that it was presented and drawn meant that and the way that this building looked, it was like, it looked a bit like Stansted Airport, which is recognized as high quality modern architecture. So you couldn't really criticize it, and that's how it was designed, that it looked like a project drawn by, a well-known modern architect.
Right.
So it couldn't really be dismissed as bad architecture. Whatever you thought of the client or the fictional client.
Were there conversations that followed regarding race as a result of that?
Not really. I didn't, after doing my postgraduate studies, it took 2 years to get an interview.
Wow.
And I wrote, 400, 500, 600 letters, in some cases 2 or 3 letters to the same architect over, a 2-year period. And by the end, my letters used to say, I know you haven't got any work. I just want to come into your office either at lunchtime or after hours and show you my diploma projects because I think they're quite interesting. And even then, no architect would give me half an hour of their time. So in the end, what I did was I found out that there was a I think it was an interior design. What was it called? I think it was called the Designers Institute or something in London. And you paid a small fee and they would, assess your portfolio. So I actually paid them a fee and then someone looked at my work. And then he actually said, I like what you've done and I'll just try and give you some work. So that's how I got my first job.
So at this point, you've gone through education, you've managed to get your foot in the door. What's your view of racism within architecture as a practice and profession decades later?
Well, I think at that time it was very difficult. And, from my own experience, a lot of Black and Asian architects end up doing all of the technical work and none of the kind of creative work. And it was sort of, for some reason, it was kind of taken for granted, And you don't go to meetings, you don't meet clients, you don't go to site visits. So your experience as an architect is really limited, and that makes it difficult because you still, after all those years of study, you still have to become a chartered architect, like a GP or a solicitor or accountant. And so those first 1, 2, or 3 years, the experience you have enables you to fully qualify.
Sure.
And so that's why it ends up taking some people longer. And sometimes after a while, if people have families or they're trying to support themselves, to study again after many years, it becomes sometimes difficult or people get disillusioned.
Yeah.
But it was very noticeable. And also, I think a lot of the offices whose work is publicized and they win awards or they're shortlisted for design competitions, I don't think there was much diversity in those offices. There wasn't much anyway in architecture generally, but even less so in those. And I suppose you didn't really try to get into those offices because of that.
Right.
So yeah, it was, there were, many challenges.
So as well as the kind of very real practical barriers into getting into fields or rarefied fields such as architecture. There's also a mental component where we kind of accept the status quo as creatives within these industries, and we just kind of accept certain things as given. I remember turning up at agencies and companies and just not expecting to see anybody who looks like me for years. And I just thought it was just not normal. I was very aware that it's a very unusual situation to find yourself in, but there are all of these conventions and these rules and this kind of subtext that you find yourself just kind of negotiating on a daily basis. And was that your experience, your professional practice at this point?
It actually started when I decided to study architecture, because when you go to, at that time, when you went to universities and there was an open day or you had physical interviews. So when you went along to the interview, there weren't that many other black or brown faces with their portfolios. I don't know what it was like when you started studying, but and for me that was quite unusual because up until then, from the age of 3 or 4 to 18, all the schools I went to in the Midlands were probably 80% Asian, 10% white, 10% black. So suddenly you go into a Department of Architecture, and that's not the case at all. It's the opposite. I was sort of thinking of, you have people like obviously David Adjaye and Zaha Hadid, who are very famous, BAME architects, and then in golf there's Tiger Woods, but that's not possible for everyone, those are kind of exceptions, I think.
I think part of the issue is when we're looking at diversity and representation, these extreme examples are held up as beacons of progress. Yeah. Where instead they're just kind of very rarefied individuals. So it's being able to talk about diversity on television and someone holding up Oprah Winfrey and saying, look, everything's fine. You've got Oprah Winfrey. So in terms of how you viewed architecture and your experience of architecture, how do you feel that racism was expressed within the built environment?
That's a sort of tricky question. For example, there are obviously buildings with the names of former slave owners, which are being changed now, both here and, in America. And then there are other buildings where there are statues or murals which depict either racist events or racist figures, and those are being, reconsidered. Obviously, you haven't got, coloured entrances and things like that anymore. It's not so overt.
Sure.
For example, I wanted to talk about an uncle of mine. He studied English, and he actually taught at a school in the 80s, I think, or late 70s, at a school in the Oval. And the way that school operated was so disturbing to him. And I'm sort of recalling one of Steve McQueen's films broadcast a couple of weeks ago called Education. Yeah. And, the experience of the black boy in that school. And my uncle had a similar experience, but as a teacher, and the way that other teachers behave and the headmaster behaved, he was so disillusioned with his first teaching experience. He didn't really teach again because he felt that it was, it was just too difficult. And actually, since then, he actually has two PhDs. So one is on the sermons of John Donne, and the other one is about teaching multicultural education and anti-racist education in all white schools. And this PhD is over 20 years old, maybe 30 years old now. So although at the moment, and certainly since lockdown, I've listened to lots of, broadcasts and podcasts and seminars about inclusion and diversity, we're not talking about new ideas, And in fact, watching the documentary about, the Stuart Hall project, again, when people like him were on television, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock on the BBC, you don't have that now. So, I kind of wanted to mention what he had done,
In your experience, is there a situation where you'll have buildings being designed or built within communities that aren't represented by the people living in those communities?
Yeah.
So how does architecture respond in terms of a cultural awareness or a cultural sensitivity, or does it just not exist?
I think it is changing now. And I mean, for example, in the last year, I worked on some affordable infill housing for the London Borough of Haringey. And after each project, they have a team that sort of designs and develops the housing, and then there are other teams that sort of manage the housing and the way people are, the way that housing is maintained and used and repaired and so on. And after each of these projects, they sort of produce a report. So they're building this knowledge of how, what works and what doesn't work for different members of Haringey. So I think that knowledge is increasing. That probably wasn't there 10, 20, 30 years ago. And people assume that, all housing occupants are the same and everybody lives the same. And that's sort of not the case. So I think that is changing.
So, I mean, this might again be quite a big question or quite a big topic to break down in a short time. But as architecture may be considered part of the Western tradition of power, can architectural aesthetics ever be acultural or neutral?
One of the things I sort of challenged in that diploma project was the use of white in architecture, and the way that architects often make models that are white, and they talk about sort of purity, pure design, pure space, pure light, without ever thinking of the implications of their language. Or often if they're producing a model of their proposal, that is white, and then the background in which they place it in is grey, which always seemed very simplistic to me. And in fact, that pavilion project I mentioned, I kind of wanted to make a black architectural model because I'd never seen an architect do that. Although having said that now, since then, David Adjaye actually has made several black buildings, and his own office is actually black on the outside and black on the inside, and the furniture's even, some of the furniture is black. But when I was studying architecture, it was sort of, the use of white in architecture. And there are some architects, well-known architects, all of their projects are white. And white is kind of, purity was never kind of questioned. And I kind of wanted to challenge that. But also, there are architects, for example, there's an architect I know who has been shortlisted for the RIBA's Sterling Prize, one of the major prizes for architecture in the UK. And this architect has had an office in North London for 30 years and is about 40 staff now. Wow. And as far as I'm aware, this architect has never employed a person of colour. And I'm not quite sure how that happens. And also, if you are an architect in an office, you must realise that there aren't any black or brown faces around you.
Yeah, sure.
What do you do? What do you say? Because it's so obvious. Well,
I think that's the thing is when we talk about diversity and inclusion and representation, is these environments send a message. So when you walk into a room and it's completely staffed by one type of person and you don't look like anybody, that sends a very strong message. When we're in an environment where buildings are designed by people who don't look like us and we're interacting with the built environment in a way where we have no influence, control or empowerment, that sends a clear message. So I find it really interesting, especially when we were talking about public spaces, and some of the work that I tried to do last year was challenging how those public spaces are used and our connection to those public spaces.
Yeah, no, I mean, to me, the idea of an office of 40 people in London, which is all male, it's not really possible anymore. In the 70s, yes, but not now. And so the idea that an office doesn't have any black or brown faces, it must be, people must notice.
Of course.
And every day at 1:00 they go out, to buy a sandwich. Who do they see on the streets? Who serves them in a sandwich bar?
Yeah.
And yet they go back into their office, and I find that it makes me angry and also curious as to, how that can happen.
And how does somebody in your position respond creatively to those issues? When you see those challenges and when you see those barriers, what are you inspired to do in response?
Well, I did make that project as a student at great risk, to to risk your potential qualification, and also to have that as the final project that you're going to show to a potential employer, I wouldn't recommend it, to everyone. But now, well, it's interesting, again, going back to sort of Steve McQueen and that Small Axe series, and reading about the response, people found it so moving, what he did. And he also tried to do it with a diverse film crew as possible, and insisted that, the cinematographer, and not only having sort of trainees who are from a diverse background, but actually having heads of department.
Yeah.
And, I really am impressed that he sort of insisted on that, and as an architect, I mean, I'm not at that level where I'm running a large office and I can make those kinds of decisions. I'd like to think that and David Adjaye has sort of done that. His office is very mixed. So I'd like to think, if I was in that position, I would do the same. Yeah. And it's taken a long time.
Well, I mean, on that note, according to a survey on diversity in architecture by Architects Journal in 2020, it showed that the profession has a serious and seemingly worsening problem with racism, creating obstacles at every level for those from a non-white background. The survey also revealed that 27% of respondents from a BAME background said they had suffered racism at their place of work. According to the testimonies, the problems went much deeper than name calling and maltreatment. More common were microaggressions, stereotyping, false narratives, denials, and erasure. Is there anything, in your opinion, that architecture can do as a profession to change course at this point?
I think there are lots of recent initiatives to improve diversity. And also to encourage more people to enter the profession. So that's even starting at sort of, infant, junior school, secondary school sort of level. I think architects didn't, as I said, they were one of the last professions to even monitor diversity within their profession. But few television programs feature BAME architects. They've had a few presenters. Maybe EastEnders needs a black or Asian architect. That'd be great, wouldn't it? Because then it becomes part of, everyday conversation. And I think maybe that's the challenge, that it is seen as, a very highbrow discipline, for some reason. Although you mentioned, people like, Kanye, being interested, and I think Ice Cube studied architecture. Did you know that?
I didn't know that. No.
Okay.
Huh. Wow.
I was going to say there's a guy in America I followed him on Twitter. I think he's called Hip Hop Architect, and he uses sort of hip hop music to visit schools and engage people in architecture. And he's been doing that for sort of a few years now. So I think there are lots of sort of crossover projects,
I think it's a really interesting point, because I think a lot of this comes down to narratives, especially when we're talking about accessibility. You can't be what you can't see. So in terms of normalizing this idea that architecture is a feasible pathway for a black or Asian student, I think is a major step. At school, architecture was like you may as well have said astronaut.
Right.
It's just the idea of it being this inaccessible, highbrow discipline that had so many barriers. You had to study for 5 years, then you had to do the thing for 7 years, then you had to do this other thing. And I think when Kanye West shows an interest in architecture, what it does is it takes this kind of highbrow discipline and it says, look, you can access this too. Because he's just an entertainer, but he's an entertainer with ideas. And that's essentially the root of where all of this comes from. So, having a black architect on EastEnders, I don't think is a crazy idea. In terms of,
you heard it here first.
Because so much of this comes down to storytelling and our ideas and these narratives that we hold and that we adhere to. Since we're talking about narratives and storytelling, can we talk about your film work as well?
Sure.
I find it really interesting that in the way you make your films, you're still exploring principles of structure and narrative.
Well, I think the way architects work, even if you're working on somebody's extension, the amount of preparation that's required is phenomenal, in terms of planning, in terms of building regulations, and obviously all the drawings and the written specifications. And so in the films that I've made, I've tried to work in a similar way and pre-plan as much as possible. But I guess I was sort of, I find Spike Lee very inspiring. And you don't have to like everything he says or does. But, I had seen films like Car Wash and Shaft in the kind of 70s. And there was a huge stream of so-called blaxploitation films at that time. And then they fizzled out once they stopped making money. And in the 80s, there really weren't any. And then suddenly, I forget what year, maybe it was very late 80s or early, I think it was in the late 80s, when Spike Lee made She's Gotta Have It, this black and white, low budget 16mm film. And no black director had made a feature film, as far as I knew, for like 20 years. And suddenly, he made a film and did something that was sort of impossible. So I found that, and when I read about it, when it came out, I was expecting it to be, like Shaft or Car Wash. And the look and feel of that film wasn't like that at all. It was this black and white film, had beautiful still photography, a jazz score played by his father. And it wasn't what I expected this black film to look and sound like. And that was really inspirational to me, that actually there wasn't any aesthetic that you had to stick to, whereas all those films in the 70s kind of look very similar.
No, I mean, I think what Spike did that was so groundbreaking was that he was also playing with the conventions of filmmaking. There were almost films about filmmaking. So in She's Gotta Have It, it's shot in black and white and it looks very arty and it feels like, a Jim Jarmusch film or something.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
And then halfway through, it completely dives into color. And there's a color sequence of this park picnic, which is inspired by MGM musicals of the 20s and 30s. So even in the work that he's doing, he's challenging conventions as he does it. And I think it's really interesting when creatives, especially people like yourself, play and explore with different disciplines and mediums.
Yeah, when I made my first film, I had worked as an architect for about 5 years and was really frustrated. I was sort of drawing toilets and car parking spaces and so on. And I thought, it had been almost 10 years, I think, since I'd finished my postgraduate diploma. And I thought I haven't really created anything in all this time, And so I had this idea for a short film, and I did an evening class where we used 16mm cameras. And I was going to use some of the students from that evening class to make my film. But I wanted to make my film to Hollywood standards using 35mm film. And it was too risky to have people who are not really that skilled. So, for example, when I made that film, the cost of the film stock, the raw film stock, was about £900. And at that time, you could go to John Lewis and buy a very good camcorder for half that price. So I already, had made quite an investment. And but the film that I was making was sort of a home movie, and it was a film of my mother cooking because she had developed arthritis from working in these knitwear factories in the Midlands. And so what I wanted to do was make a home movie, but to Hollywood standards. And my film concept was a film of my mother cooking, but it was inspired by the fight sequences from Martin Scorsese's Raging Bull.
Yep.
So in terms of a creative concept, it was basically a collision. It was taking two ideas that don't belong together and would never be mentioned in the same sentence. A 53-year-old Indian mother and Jake LaMotta and Raging Bull. And I basically, crashed one against the other. And so what I want to do is challenge, what a film about, a 53-year-old Indian mother with arthritis, what does that look or sound like? And as an audience member, what are you going to expect? You're probably going to expect some shaky camera work and poor quality sound And, it is basically the sort of home movie which at that time people was just starting to upload onto YouTube, which was sort of new, or images of, clips of their pets or something, And I sort of wanted to do the opposite. I wanted to make something that really belonged on the silver screen. So we filmed it in 35mm, and we were able to get hold of the sorts of cameras that are used to make, big budget adverts and James Bond action sequences.
Wow.
Because we were filming in different time speeds. So I was lent a camera that at the time was worth more than my flat in London. So it was like someone lending you a Ferrari. It was sort of nerve-wracking, but also exciting. But I didn't know what would happen. And as I said, I was frustrated as an architect, and the work I was doing was never going to be published. It wasn't going to win any awards. And then I made this little film. And because I broke so many rules of documentary filmmaking, suddenly it became, a very famous short film and screened in all sorts of festivals. And, it qualified for the short documentary Oscar. It wasn't nominated because those sorts of films are normally about serious subjects like war or famine or disease, but it was still very exciting.
That's great. And was there, or do you feel there's a connection between the themes you explore in your film work and your architectural work, or is the film work more about the things that you can't say in architecture? I like
film because, they really affect people and move people. And when people come out of cinema, whether they've seen a horror film or an art film or an action film or comedy, they're so animated. And people don't do that generally when they come in and out of buildings. So architecture doesn't have that effect on people,
right.
Whereas film and, football and food and fashion, they do, hence the kinds of magazines you see when you go into a newsagent. So I'm a bit envious of people doing those other things, but the films I've made, even the first architectural film, none of them have dialogue, which makes them international potentially. And hopefully they can be seen by people of all ages. And I find that quite a challenge, how do you make a piece of work that actually children might engage with in some way, and even, pensioners and everyone in between. I sort of like that.
So it's like you're building a narrative without dialogue.
Yeah. And it's just that, can the images or maybe the use of color or sound or music, can you use those in a certain way to affect people, and people don't have to have any prior knowledge of the subject. To me, that's a kind of interesting challenge. What subjects can you present to a wide audience, which they initially might not have an interest in.
Yeah, that's really, really fascinating. Where can people find your work?
My films are all on Vimeo, and they're also on my website, and they're on Twitter as well. So, although one of them, talking about sort of different aesthetics, one is about farming and the sort of foot and mouth disease, and it has images of dead animals. So I guess that would be, 16 plus.
Yeah, definitely.
because of that. But the others are all sort of family friendly.
That's great. Okay, well, we'll include links to that in the show notes for this episode. In wrapping up, do you have any advice, tactics, or perspectives for aspiring architects or designers in navigating these industries?
I wouldn't have any advice or tactics for architects per se, but I would say just recently I saw a documentary about the making of a concert called Sleep by a musician stroke composer called Max Richter. And he's also done music for films. He did Martin Scorsese's Shutter Island and Ad Astra and a few others. And this concert is 8 hours, and people are invited to come and basically sleep through part of it, all of it, the end of it. And he performs on stage with, a small group of musicians for 8 hours continuously. But during this hour and a half long documentary, he talks about the first decade of being a sort of musician and his music being almost unheard. and how poor he and his wife was. And they had to decide whether to feed their children or themselves. And that kind of challenge or difficulty is not often spoken about in terms of doing something creative. And in the film, he says, well, he felt unable to compromise creatively, so he could only make that kind of music. He didn't want to make music, that was more commercial. And also, he couldn't imagine doing anything else in life. He studied music and wanted to be a composer. And obviously now he's sort of successful. But I think that kind of difficulty, whether you're, someone making ceramics on your own or writing poetry or studying architecture, or doing fashion, whatever. I think that kind of difficulty and challenge isn't discussed enough. It is too easy to talk about, Tiger Woods, Kanye, and Spike Lee.
The successes and the wins.
Yeah, yeah. And actually, if you want to do something, you will do it. And there will be sort of challenges. But I mean, that's kind of an extreme example, in terms of feeding yourself. But he didn't give up. And I'm sure, Spike did, commercials for Nike and so on. But at the beginning, it must have been really difficult,
Yeah, yeah.
And also to be the only, to be one black filmmaker representing, all black people in America. But that's impossible.
Yeah, yeah, of course. I mean, it speaks to the level of perseverance and determination in the face of these barriers and these challenges.
So I think reading about people who haven't had success, if there's any advice I could give, I would say read and study those people as well, not just the people who are published. Listen to music that's difficult to get hold of, or work that isn't published. I would say those are the people that maybe are worth supporting as much as the others.
That's great. That's really, really valuable insight. Thanks for joining us. I know you've got to get off, but I appreciate your time. For everyone listening or watching, Nilesh's career is a fantastic case study of cultivating the ability to switch between mediums or disciplines, to explore our passions and the things we advocate for. His work demonstrates how we can place ourselves in our work, pushing the boundaries to explore and create and challenge narratives. This kind of work not only creates access in fields historically off limits to Black and Asian and minority ethnic designers and creatives, such as architecture, it inspires us to create our own pathways, no matter how unconventional. Thanks for joining us today. Just a quick note to say the podcast is available in audio and video format. You can find all the links as well as the episode links at bunbury.co/podcast. That's bunbury.co/podcast. Thanks again for listening, and join me next time for more inspiring conversations.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Design for the People with Greg Bunbury.